Can everyone hear me? We're just about ready to start. Just wanted to make sure you can hear me. Can everyone hear me? We're just about ready to start. Just wanted to make sure you can hear me. Hey, welcome. I'm Chris Monlux. I am the multimedia editor here at VideoMaker, and you're watching our Mastering Depth of Field webinar. This is going to be mostly presentation today, and it'll be me presenting till noon Pacific time. Okay, so what I want to first thing is if anybody's over on YouTube here, let me get this mic a little closer. If you are on YouTube right now or on Facebook, why don't you go over to videomaker.com/live? That way I can actually answer your questions. I'm not going to be looking at the chat on Facebook or YouTube, just on videomaker.com/live. So go on over there. Same video, same everything. Just it's going to be a lot easier for me to follow all of your comments and whatnot. Okay. Let's see here. I can kind of see him. I'm going to have to actually zoom in. I don't wear my glasses on camera so that I don't have a bunch of glare. So, yeah. Okay, let me get that up there. All right, let me go over what we're going to be covering today. So it's going to be 60 minutes. Talked about that just a little bit. We're going to be done by 12 o'clock Pacific time. This is going to be instructional format, so make sure to use the chat window and ask relevant questions throughout the presentation. If we get done before noon, we can play Stump Chris, and you can ask any question you want about video production. I will be happy to try to answer it for you. But if there isn't a lot of time at the end, you'll be kind of out of luck. But today we're going to be talking about depth of field, obviously, how to get shallow depth of field, how to get deep depth of field. We're going to be talking about the sensor size and its role in depth of field. We're going to be talking about depth of field for camcorders, and then tips and tricks about getting shallow depth of field. All right, so let's see here. Just going to give one more warning. If you are on Facebook or on YouTube, go over to videomaker.com/live. I will be participating in the chat there. I will not be watching the chat anywhere else. Definitely the best place for you to go. And it signs you up when you go over there for our email newsletter, which is really our most popular product we have at VideoMaker. Just, giving our content to you directly to your inbox 3 times a week. Super easy and really valuable. Everybody that signs up finds it really valuable, and you'd be notified of the next webinar that we're going to have, which gets me over to our marketing. So our next webinar is Wednesday, October 20th. Again, a Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific time. It's going to be creating titles and graphics. And it's a great presentation. I really enjoyed teaching this one because motion graphics sometimes can be eluding for people. And so this is going to be talking about how to create titles and graphics and going over really just the basics there. And then we have our last chance right now. So if you want to win a Canon Rebel T7i, we are giving one away right now. It's ending really soon, like next week. So make sure to sign up at videomaker.com/win. Go there. You can sign up a whole bunch of different ways, but that way you can be entered to win the T7i. All right. With that said, let's get started. Yeah, let's jump over to this oh man, I'm struggling with words already. This is a problem with the presentation. That's the word I was looking for. Here you go. All right. So Mastering Depth of Field presented by myself, an editor, videomaker.com. I'm also the TD today, so bear with me if I leave my face on screen or it seems like I should be talking to you. You should be seeing me instead of the presentation. Let me know. That way I don't make you just look at my face when I mean to be showing you a presentation and vice versa. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about depth of field. We're going to be explaining it, talking about why shallow depth of field or deep depth of field, how to get shallow or how to get deep depth of field, talking about the sensor size, depth of field for small sensor camcorders, and tips. And then there's a place at the end for questions, but please feel free to ask your questions as long as they're what we're talking about and on topic. I'm happy to answer them because I'm sure someone else is thinking that same question, and maybe you are the one that has enough courage to ask the question. And so do someone a favor, ask your question. There's no dumb questions. Likely someone else here is thinking the same question. Okay, so let's jump into depth of field explained. So depth of field is the area of an image that appears in focus. If you look at that top image there of the lenses, obviously that first lens, that's what's in focus, right? So the depth of field is how much area is in focus. You can see the lenses behind it are out of focus. So shallow depth of field is a small area in front and behind the subject that will be in sharp focus. Deep depth of field is a large area in front and behind the subject that will be in sharp focus. And as much as we talk a lot about getting a shallow depth of field and how that's kind of the look of cinema, right? It's what you see most of the time. It helps control the eye and all the rest. We don't talk too much about deep depth of field. However, it's super valuable for certain types of productions. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but you think of your live action sports and situations where you can't control your subject or the shooting situation. A deep depth of field can be your friend and really make it so that you could get a beautiful image. It just might not be as shallow as you'd like it to be, but deep depth of field is not something to shy away from. Steve L. asked, will there be a PDF slide deck that will be shared? This will change how I take notes. Steve, if you are not a VideoMaker Plus member, you will not have access to the PDF. However, if you are, yes, you can ask for it. Go to email customer service. They'll look up your account and we'll be able to send it out to you. However, for everybody else, you're only going to get to watch this live now. It will not be available after the presentation. We'll be taking it down. It'll be behind our paywall. So best way to watch this again, watch all of our other webinars. We have all of the webinars that we present available right now that's on there. They're past recordings, obviously. And then you can get notifications for the future ones, but make sure if you want to sign up for Plus membership, which also gets you access to our over 40 courses of video production that I've produced a lot of them for. They're really great. It's a great asset for anyone that wants to dive deep and get better at making video. So to answer your question, Steve L., likely not unless you are a Plus member. And in that case, yes, you can get one. All right. So why shallow depth of field? So you're going to want to get shallow depth of field because really you're able to hide and control the eye of your viewer. So less is in focus. It directs the viewer's attention. It tells the viewer what not to look at. It minimizes the distracting elements in a shot. I have a good example of this. I was shooting at for a commercial for a place that sold furniture, and the floor manager had his desk out on the floor, and it was kind of surrounded by all sorts of junk. He wasn't a very tidy guy, and so he said, can you not shoot towards my desk? And it's like it's one big room, so likely some of our shots will need to be that way. And really, how I answer that is, yeah, we'll just make sure it's blurry in the background. So that was really helpful because you couldn't tell the mess because it was so blurred from the shallow depth of field. One of the big things that you might not think about, but that the negative space that's created by the blurred background is really great for using for graphics or just creating a negative space so you can put other things in. Your shallow depth field will also help you perfect your composition. And how it does this is really the same way as it hid that desk that I was talking about, is that it hides those things that might be distracting to the viewer's eye so that you can have a really beautiful composition without having to really change much. And then it also can be used to reveal something like a rack focus. So if you're trying to hide who it is holding the gun, but you want to show the gun, you can use shallow depth of field to show the gun, but have the subject that's holding the gun out of focus. Ooh, awesome, Steve. I'm super glad that you are a Plus member. Yeah, you can, Steve. Customer service at videomaker.com. Email them, and they'll be able to look up your account. So why deep depth of field? So like I was talking about earlier, so now you have more in focus. You have more things in focus. It's easier to keep things in focus because everything's in focus, or more is in focus. And it's good when everything needs to be sharp, like events or sports. So think about, shooting a football game and having to follow the action. You might start off and you could be close up on a quarterback getting the football, and yeah, you could have a shallow depth of field, but as soon as action happens, so as soon as the ball's hiked to him, he's going to move back in the field, and all of a sudden you're going to have to follow them with that focus if you had a shallow depth of field. Now, if you have a deeper depth of field, you're not going to have to worry about that because more things are in focus already. So all you have to do is follow the action. You don't have to follow the action and keep it in focus. And it's very difficult to do those things sometimes. I mean, when we get really spoiled by watching just amazing camera operators at golf, for golf games, baseball, football. I mean, I saw a home run the other day where the guy had a medium shot where the ball came off the bat, and he was able to keep the ball in frame until it went into the stands and was a home run. I mean, that's amazing camera work. And that's something that if you shoot the same thing over and over and over again, you get really good at those things. You get better at anticipating where things are going to go, the speed that they're going to move, and all that. So that's when you can really go the next step. If you are wanting a shallow depth of field, if you know how things are going to move, then you can get a shallower depth of field. And this is easily done on a set when you have control of your actors and your setup and everything, because you can get and say, I mean, if you've ever heard the term have the actor hit their mark, those are marks on the ground so that you can keep them in focus. It might be to be able to keep them in focus as they're moving. It might be able to just keep the focus so you can keep the camera from a certain distance from them so that things stay in focus. But absolutely is where the strength of a closed set and full control of your shooting situation really comes into handy. But definitely not something that if you are shooting documentary or camera verte or cinema verte, I'm sorry, or anything like that at an event like a wedding or something else, is you don't really have control over everything. You might know where marks are hitting. Obviously, in a wedding, you're going to know where the bride and groom are going to stop, but it might be hard to figure out what the ring bearer is going to do. It might be a 2-year-old kid, and maybe he does something funny like picks his nose on his way down. You might have to be a lot tighter on him. So just one of those things that if you are not controlling the situation and you don't know what your subject's going to do, a deeper depth of field is going to be helpful, really helpful. If you're currently on Facebook or on YouTube, go over to videomaker.com/live and you'll be able to join us and I'll be able to answer your questions if you have any there. I'm not looking at the chat anywhere else. All right, let's go on to the next slide. All right, so this is a good example of being able to reveal focus. Obviously, we don't even know if this person has a mouth or a nose. I mean, it looks like they might be an alien in this shot. We could tell they're holding the gun by kind of the direction. I mean, those are kind of cues we might just assume. But you don't know who's holding the gun. And this can create a lot of mystery in your stories. Obviously we're doing all these things to help your story be stronger, help the viewer to understand and see it. It can be also for a more beautiful image and all the rest. But really the biggest idea for any type of content creation, video wise, is to have your story in check. Make sure you're making production choices based on your story, because your story, if it's at its strongest, all those other things are really going to shine and show off your ability to make beautiful video. So in this case, we have this guy holding the gun. We don't know who it is until, I guess we don't. We're never going to know who's holding the gun. So this might be the mystery. This is the first shot in the whole movie. You see the fire burst from the gun, and you see the main actor of the movie die. The first scene. Wow, wouldn't that be amazing, right? Very first scene, you kill off the main character that is like the big money actor, right? Well, maybe you're jumping in time and this is the end of the movie, but you're starting it off with it so you can tell the story. And in this case, maybe the whole story is who shot them and why they might have wanted to shoot them and all the rest, the story of how they got there. So here in Saving Private Ryan, you can see here, this is on D-Day. They're doing the kind of revealing what's around them through not only backing away from your subject matter and revealing the things around them, like that guy vomiting there, or that guy. But you can see here when we're close up on Tom Hanks's face, the character in the background just over his shoulder is definitely a shallower depth of field. He's not in focus, but as you pull away from Tom Hanks, you can see that more things are in focus. So a deep depth of field is what was necessary for the shot in the long way. I'm guessing they're pulling focus, and that's how they're able to keep things continually getting in focus from the foreground, and the background clears up as well when that happens. This is a good shot here. This is obviously the opposite direction. The barrel of the gun is going, from left to right. So it's not what he's shooting, but possibly what's there in that negative space in the green. Now I know this is actually to be true. I put this image here, but he's looking down the gun. He wants to shoot at something, right? What is it? Do we know who knows this movie? I'll give it a couple seconds, and it's Jurassic Park. So you can see he's looking down the barrel of the gun thinking he's going to shoot that T-Rex, and then all of a sudden, oh no, T-Rex is over his shoulder. Ooh, bad news. Total great suspense, very good storytelling, right? You have you're concerned about the subject holding the gun, then all of a sudden this shows there's the T-Rex waiting for him. Really, really great storytelling. So here's also, this is with not only selective focus, so we have a shallow depth of field. Obviously, we have Leonardo DiCaprio there in the middle, and he's in focus, and really mostly other than the lady that's there with him, is somewhat out of focus. There are some things that you can make them out, but they're really not important to the story, and obviously you can't really see any of their faces really clearly. You might be able to see this guy over here, his face a little bit, but obviously all these people around him don't matter to the story, and that's why it's there. That's a raptor. You're right, Brother Rick. And so, it's a raptor. It's not a T-Rex. You're right. Man, I should watch Jurassic Park again. Anyhow, so I think this is Great Gatsby, this movie here. And so not only with light, so you can see that they're lit, whereas everybody else doesn't have necessarily a key light on them. They're not as bright as Leo is here. And along with that selective focus tells the viewer here, they're who you should look at. Now, obviously, you have a lead actor. You're going to probably try to find them in any scene as a viewer and look for them to tell you the story and to follow the story. But in this case, even if you didn't know who Leo was, you would know to look at him because of the selective focus and selected lighting. So the need for shallow depth of field. Let's talk about a problem like the background of the shot is messy. Use the shallow depth of field and the background will blur away. That's my example of the furniture store. I used it just to make it so that the background wasn't distracting. It had nothing to do with aesthetics. I was not trying to make a negative space so I could put graphics, although I think I ended up doing that because of the shallow depth of field. You were able to put graphics and they could pop up a lot greater. That's super important when making television commercials in general, because likely you're going to be speaking a lot in both verbally and visually. Here's another problem. Things in composition are distracting. So maybe there's something that's moving. Maybe it's you can't control it. It's a 5-year-old in the background and he's picking his nose. Who knows what it is, but you're using it to select what the viewer can see. And then lastly, the shot isn't as intimate as desired. So, just like we do when we get close to things, our eyes focus just like a lens would, and we're able to get sharper focus when things are really close to us. Right. So, and then those things are in focus and everything else is out of focus. Now, you might not pay attention to that with your own eye because obviously your attention's going with where your focal point is. You're not actually thinking, I want to be in focus with this, but your brain's doing it for you. But the thing about that is you only have that really close focus when you're really close to somebody. So thinking about going in for a kiss, that's total romantic, great story point, and the thing is usually those that are doing that are very singularly focused on what they're doing. That intimate experience is not being distracted by the things around them. It's about that gesture. Likely in your story, it's leading to something else, right? So need for deep depth of field. Problem, subject is moving from their mark. So, we say hit your mark, they're not hitting their mark. Maybe because you don't have control, maybe because you have an amateur actor, who knows? But this is a really helpful thing just to think about. Sometimes you have an actor that is able to make adjustments. Hey, you missed your mark, hit your mark this time. That's great. But if you're working with an amateur or someone that or maybe it's an actor that's not listening to you, you don't have to get in a conflict with that actor. You can just choose to change your camera control and get a little bit deeper depth of field, and maybe it's not as important that they don't hit their mark. So there are things and adjustments we can make just to, get the job done. Maybe it won't be as beautiful as you intended, but the story, like I said, is key. No matter what you're doing, no matter how long that story is, even a 30-second commercial's got a story. So making sure to follow the story and make sure it's the center of your attention will really be key. So another problem, multiple subjects over a large area. This is that football game, right? I'm going to need to get Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers as in focus as I can, but I'm also wanting to make sure that the receiver, when they get the ball 30 yards down the field, that they're also in focus when I am following the football to them. It's very hard to keep a really shallow depth of field. I'm gonna give you a little example here. If you've never shot shallow depth of field, or you're new to this, which I likely you are, you're watching this webinar. My first intention when I thought, I can now shoot from a shallow depth of field, because I went from camcorders to a DSLR, and that was when, really for shooting video was one of the first times you're able to go from that, make that transition. And I thought, well, I can shoot at f1.2 because I have this 50 millimeter f1.2 lens. But I'd have to say the 15 years I've been producing videos, I have had very, very few needs for a shallow depth of field at f1.2. That is more specialty shooting than you might think. In fact, I used to think that f2.8 was a great setting for interviews, but it's not really, unless you need that shallow depth of field to hide something or whatever else, because likely someone's going to rock in their chair. If they're standing, they're likely to move a little bit and sway. And those types of things will get your subject out of focus, say if you're doing an interview. And the last thing you want is someone saying something of some consequence and them being out of focus. That's just no good, especially if you don't have control over it. So, think you're interviewing the president and he moves and hey, can you say that again? You're not going to do that to the president. You're not going to, someone of importance, you're not going to ask them to say it again. Maybe you do out of stupidity or whatever, but likely it's not going to be taken very well. They're going to go, no, I'm not going to do that again. In fact, I'm done. So be careful of that. And so we can, as the technical side of this operation, being the camera operator, make better choices. So I shoot, like my shot right now is actually at f4, and you can see the depth of field that I'm dealing with. My background is maybe 6 feet behind me. This is f4. I think this is a nice shallow depth of field. It's enough to kind of show that off. It's not enough to be distracted by we have lots of cameras over here. Sometimes they're set up, sometimes I used them and they're not put back well. So it's just to hide those things, but you couldn't really tell if it was messy or not. You can make their cameras, but that's more by their silhouette. And then the other subject is moving, keeps depth of field to keep them focused. This is that same thing. Your subject is fidgety, they rock. I mean, I've had it all. I've had from people that I interviewed my grandfather who had Parkinson's. He shook. It's just part of his life and how he's experiencing it. And so, if he's shaking, I want to capture that humanity, surely. But that I want to make sure that he's not in and out of focus because he can't stay in one place. I've shot people with disabilities that might not be able to sit in one place for very long, comfortably. Also very helpful there. But honestly, you know what's the hardest is little kids. Kids got all sorts of energy. They don't know where to put it. And so, you know, making sure to shoot with a deeper depth of field, a larger F number, and you will be able to keep them in focus. And you know, it's going to be a whole lot better to have a deeper depth of field and your subject in focus than a shallow depth of field and your subject going in and out of focus. Just not going to be any good. Okay, so how to get shallow depth of field? Shoot at a lower F number. So this is counterintuitive. The smaller the F number, the larger the opening of the lens, therefore the more amount of light that comes in, and therefore gives you a shallower depth of field. To compensate for more light coming in, so say you're trying to shoot a shallow depth of field outside in midday sun, you're going to want to lower your ISO or gain. Likely you're going to lower it as low as you can in that situation, but depending on your situation, you're going to lower your ISO or gain. That the ISO is where noise comes in. Keith says autofocus helps. Depends on the autofocus. I would not trust a lot of autofocus. I'm currently using autofocus, but it's some of the best in the business. Canon's dual pixel autofocus is pretty nails. Definitely the most recent Sony cameras, also very great. But I'd have to say I've used dozens of cameras that their autofocus is such garbage. I would never recommend using it. And as a filmmaker or as someone controlling what someone else sees, I want to be able to make those choices of where my focal point goes. So I remember having to use autofocus, maybe shooting off a gimbal, right? You just don't have access to be able to manually control your focus that way. Autofocus can be helpful, but like I said, it could hunt. It could go, oh, this is the subject's in focus. Nope, now the background is. Now his nose is in focus, but his eyes aren't. Now his ears are in focus, but not his nose. It'll start looking around for a place to keep focus, and some autofocus systems don't stick. They just aren't helpful. But if you're lucky enough to use dual pixel autofocus from any Canon camera, or some of the newest AI-driven autofocus on the Sony Alpha cameras, I wouldn't recommend it. There's not many that are out there. You'll have to get really good settings. So the Panasonic GH series line, right, the GH4 or 5, 5.2, they all have pretty good autofocus, but you have to really make sure to get the settings right for the situation you're shooting in. So just setting in an autofocus is not good enough. You need to tell it how quickly you want it to change autofocus, how quickly it gets to that focus, and then also the type of subject matter you're shooting. It'll take that in as well. Okay, getting deeper into shallow depth of field. So to compensate for the more light coming in from lowering your f-stop number, you're going to lower your ISO or gain. That's going to decrease the light level in the scene. Use an ND filter. ND filters are just sunglasses for your camera. Think of them as your ability to shoot a higher f number in bright sunlight when you're already shooting at the lowest ISO. When I'm shooting outside, I'm shooting at the lowest ISO that I possibly can. This is outside during the day, that is. Usually it's 50 or 100, depending on your camera. Maybe it's 150, might even be 200, but probably not any higher than that. And the higher the ISO, the more noise or the more light comes in, but also the more noise comes in. So beware of that. And using a faster shutter speed can be helpful because the higher your shutter speed is, the less light that comes in. However, I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you're just in a pinch. You want to keep your shutter speed double the frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, it would be great to have your shutter speed 1/480th. Now, 1/50th is close enough. Even 1/60th is close enough if your camera doesn't go to 1/48th or 1/50th of a second. But if you go above that, what you start to get is staccato movement. And this is like really shuttery movement. It feels a lot more like stop animation does than real life playing. So just be careful with that. And the higher your shutter speed is, the more samples you have. So a really good example of this is with water. If you're shooting water with a higher shutter speed, you're going to see all of the drops and all of the things spraying out and that kind of thing, where you wouldn't notice those because they disappear in motion blur if you were shooting at a lower shutter speed. So be careful of that. So longer focal lengths are perceived to have a shallower depth of field. So if you pack up from your subject and zoom in, a shallower perceived depth of field happens. And this is through space compression. And what it does is it brings your background closer to the subject so that the background, which is further away from your subject, is pulled closer. So it looks like it's shallower depth of field. But really all it is bringing the further away background to look closer to your subject. This is how they get the beautiful giant sun or moon on the horizon. The curvature of the Earth does this, does space compression for us. This is also, using a telephoto lens, which is a longer throw lens, a zoom lens that's, 70 millimeters or greater, that it will bring your background and bring it closer to your foreground. So here's what your F numbers will do, right? So this is on a full frame camera shooting at 50 millimeters. We have f1.2, and you can see there, like, there's hardly anything in focus. The sharpest focus is just that line at the beginning of the chart. That's it. And that's the focal point for all of these, right? So we have the focus right there, and all that's changed is the ISO and the shutter speed, or I'm sorry, the ISO and the aperture to get these. So then we go up to f2.5, not likely. Most people shoot f2.8 just because that's like the maximum aperture on a lot of lenses, especially zoom lenses, on fast zoom lenses. Fast, I mean ones with low F numbers. And still there, not a lot in focus. Maybe the first white block there, white and black block, but not a whole lot more. You can kind of make out lines, but everything's definitely all sorts of blurry. And look at the background on both those shots. If you look at those compared to the F14. So at the, even all of those top line images, if you look down to F14, I'm going to tell you, because you might not know what it is. There's a stand there with a black stick kind of going horizontally or diagonally there. And then you kind of see a top of a ladder. The little white loop there is a ladder. You can tell what that is at F14. You can kind of make it out at F10 and F7.1. But if you go to 3.5 there, oh man, I don't really know what that is. It's just blurry. And definitely by 1.2, it's blurry. So if you keep on moving in, 3.5 looks pretty good. You have a few of those bars. Likely you have a few inches of focus, focal length. Whereas by F7.1, you can see that you probably have a foot or more focus, and then it just keeps on growing as you go from there. Deep depth of field. So this is what I was talking about with space compression. So the effect of focal length, these are both shot at the same exposure at the same F number, but one is shot at with a wide angle. And so the framing is the same here, but where the camera is in relation to the subject is different. So the 24 millimeter, he's probably only an arm's length away from the guy. And this is at the old Videomaker headquarters here. And this was the patio that was out front of the building. And you can see there's all sorts of things. You can see that umbrella in the background. You can kind of see there's kind of some planter boxes and whatnot. But then if you move over to 105 millimeter, wow, how are those the same exposure? They just don't look it. Well, it brings the background and makes it seem a lot closer. So not only are you seeing a lot less of the background, but you're also getting a perceived shallower depth of field. And a lot of people get this wrong because this is kind of a trick you might used to do with a camcorder that makes it very difficult to get a shallow depth of field, is you do the back away from your subject and zoom in. So I've shot something where I've been like 150 feet away from my subject. And of course, what that makes it do is the camera movements become very difficult. But if this was a static shot, this would be a far better shot on the right than on the left. Whereas he looks like he's a little hunched over. All that stuff comes from that wider field of view. All right. So here's another example of what lens compression can do. And I think this is a really good example of what it can do to the face. A lot of people, I've shot a lot of people that, I haven't shot with the camera, a lot of people doing interviews or whatever, but that the person that I'm shooting is actually the client, right? So I'm doing an interview of them about their business or whatever it is, but they're paying the bill. So I have to make sure that they look good. I mean, that's a really important thing. If you're a DP for a director and the director's starring in the film, make sure he looks good. If you want more work, don't kick a gift horse in the mouth, make them look good. So in this case, you can see that at 24 millimeter, her forehead is big, her nose is big, her lips look big. Not only that, but you can see the background. You can kind of see the ceiling, you can see the background of the shot. But if you go all the way to 350 millimeter, man, all those things, her nose, her forehead, start looking more flat. And so if you are shooting someone that's a little larger or has larger features, sometimes shooting more telephoto will, not sometimes, shooting telephoto will help you. But what it does is it means you're backing away from your subject and zooming in. So communication can become more difficult. And so, you know, having an answer for that. I've had times where I had a walkie-talkie and I had my assistant laying on the ground, able to talk and say action to the subject because the camera was actually so far away. So, you know, if you think you're going to need to do this, just plan accordingly. But you can see this is just, it's a really great example of what space compression is going to do to your subject. This is why when shooting portraits, portrait photographers use a telephoto lens, because it's almost always more flattering on the face and subject and their features. So here's a quote from Gavin Thurston, the operator on Bears and Monkey Kingdom. This is shooting a documentary of wild animals, right? So we were shooting as near to wide open, meaning the lowest F number they have as possible on these lenses to protect the shallow depth of field, to really draw the viewer's eyes into what you wanted them to see. The tricky part was that you're only about half an inch of focus. So literally all the follow focusing is on the fly. There's no auto focusing. And this is true for a lot of cinema lenses and professional lenses, that the autofocus is just not there. You don't even have it to use. So being careful there. And so really, if you want these beautiful shots, I mean, look at the shot of the monkey with the camera is awesome. That's like super Instagram right there, right? But the two cute little monkeys next to each other, like, it's just, one, it feels intimate because the shallow depth of field, which makes them feel like they're together. This looks like maybe a siblings or a father and son, or maybe they're two females. I have no idea. These are just monkeys to me. But that they, that it really captures that shot. There's something green in this shot, but it's not important. And so that's really what he was trying to do here. So on his next quote, he says, at the start of Monkey Kingdom in particular, I'd say 60% of the rushes were soft. So rushes is just pulling the focus. So trying to find that focus point, and that 60% of their shots were not usable. Towards the end of the production, we got much better. Maybe only 20% was unusable. We got embarrassed into getting better. He credits the improvement to patience and anticipating the monkey's movements. And that absolutely is super helpful. I shot, I don't know if you ever heard of a thing called a blob. It's like a big giant pillow full of air. They put it on water, and someone sits on one side of it and another person jumps from a high area and lands on it, and then shoots the other person up in the air. I, with a waterproof camera, was with a life jacket on so I could float in the water, was anticipating trying to shoot these people coming off of the blob. And really, depending on the weight difference between the subject and the person that was jumping onto the blob, meant the velocity they were coming off the pillow was greater. So I really had to figure out and anticipate that speed to really be able to get my shots. And you totally do. Like, if you can't get a shot and bring it back to show somebody, you're never going to want to show them your soft focuses or the slop of a shot. Like, that's where people start to judge you of like, oh, you must not be a professional. It's like, no, professionals have blurry shots too. They just don't show them to you. So be careful with that. So, in this case, I imagine it was the producer was like, man, we got a whole bunch of stuff here, but man, there's so much of this is crap because you guys couldn't get your focus in. So they, that embarrassment really fed their need to try to keep it better. And, whatever gets you there, it sucks to feel embarrassed, but, maybe you guys can beat him there and just try to anticipate things and have more functional, or more usable content at the end of a shoot day. I know I get jealous sometimes of photographers that could go out, and if they capture a few just awesome moments, their day is they could have shot 1,000 images and walk away with, a fraction of those. Like, even if you said 10%, you came home with 100 pictures from shooting 1,000, you'd be amazingly happy if you were a photographer. However, if you were shooting on set and, only 10% of what you shot was in focus, you get fired real quick. In fact, I don't even think you'd make the whole day. They'd be like, get out of here. So, be careful about that, making sure that your focus when you're doing these shallow depth of field is really the biggest key, is keeping things in focus, because HD, surely 4K, and even higher resolutions are not forgiving to a missed focal point. Okay, so how to get a deep depth of field. So obviously it's the opposite, right, of shooting deep depth of field. Shoot at a higher f-stop, so the higher the f number, the smaller the opening in the lens, but the deeper the depth of field. So compensate for the reduction of light coming in by taking the ND filters off if you aren't already shooting them. Increase the light by turning your light up, getting it closer to your subject, whatever you can do. Raising the ISO again, be careful there as you will get to a point of diminishing returns by introducing noise into the image at a certain point, depending on your camera. Most mirrorless cameras can shoot up to ISO 6400. I'd say that's pretty safe across all manufacturers. Unlikely you're going to get something from a cheaper camera above that is going to be professional looking. And then a slower shutter speed, of course, that means, but I would never shoot below double your frame rate. So like we said, we wouldn't go above it. We wouldn't go below it. Honestly, I'd try to keep your shutter speed as constant as possible. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, it's 1/48th. If you're shooting 30 frames per second, it's 1/60th. If you're shooting 60 frames per second, 1/120th. And I would just keep it there. So do all the things you can otherwise and make adjusting your shutter speed the last thing you do, because honestly, you just don't want to do it. Okay. Just trying to make sure there are any questions in there. If anybody has any questions, please ask them. Likely someone else has got the same question. Hyper focal distance, do not focus on infinity. Yeah. So, well, I wouldn't say that, Keith. It depends on the camera. So there's parfocal lenses that you can zoom in, get a focus, and pull out, and your focus point's the same. Those are lenses like cinema lenses are meant to do that. Likely most cinema lenses are parfocal. And camcorders and cameras with lenses built in. That was always the trick I remember doing when I was shooting camcorders, like zoom into your subject, get them in focus, zoom back out into your framing, you're good. Well, when you zoom back out on, say, a DSLR or mirrorless camera with a photo lens, likely the focus isn't going to hold. It's going to shift as you zoom in or zoom out. And so use a shorter focal length. So wider lenses are far easier to keep in focus because of that space compression thing, right? So shooting a wide shot, you're able to get closer to your subject and likely more things can be in focus. And of course, that background isn't going to be compressed, so you're not going to even have the appearance of that. So here's another example of what you can expect from lenses at different f numbers here. So you can see if you look at all of these, like say that was actually someone sitting there, which one of these is one that would be that you'd want to use, right? I don't really like seeing, so this is our old studio and this is just a rack that was in the background that I almost never used as background because it was kind of messy all the time. We just had all of our stuff on it. I would shoot below 7.1 because I wouldn't want to see that. Likely f5, I'd probably be between f3.5 and f5, which would be f4, which is usually where I start at. I start at f4 regardless of the speed of my lens. Of course, if it can do f4, hopefully it can. That's the best. Beware of lenses that change its maximum aperture across the length of the lens. So a cheaper zoom might be a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, but it has at 70 millimeters, its maximum aperture is f3.5, but at 200 millimeters, it's 5.6. So it actually darkens as you zoom the lens. So for video shooters, that means you just shoot at 5.6 no matter what your zoom is. So Sherman asks, what about just using a smaller sensor camera for max depth of field? Sherman, we're going to be getting onto that. That's up next, to just how to get a shallower depth of field using a smaller sensor camera like a camcorder, a cell phone, a drone, an action camera, really anything that is smaller than micro four thirds lens. And really, when it comes to video production, Sony and Canon are going to try to, and Nikon are going to try to sell you a full frame camera. I guess so is Panasonic, but really you don't need it. Cameras for a long time have been Super 35 for film production and whatnot. That larger sensor is just going to mean that you're going to be able to get your framing a lot easier in tight quarters and than you could otherwise. It is nice, definitely nice to have, but isn't something that's really going to change the world if you might think that. There are other benefits from a large sensor, but achieving a shallower depth of field is not one of them if you have the right lens for what you're shooting. So a demonstration, I think you guys all kind of get that. Okay, sensor size and the crop factor. So everything below a full frame camera, which we call full frame now, and by full frame it comes from the history of film and still photography is what we're talking about here, because these are really still photography first cameras. These are not, although they can shoot video, they are all designed for photography first. And a full frame sensor is the same size that 35 millimeter film was, right? So that's the space of which all lenses are designed for. So if you shoot a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame camera, you're shooting at 50 millimeter. However, if the sensor's smaller, there's a thing called the crop factor. So a lens focal length is based on the standard size of that 35 millimeter film. A sensor equivalent to a 35 millimeter film has a full frame sensor. Full frame sensor has no focal length multiplier. A sensor smaller than full frame sensor will have a focal length multiplier, or also known as the crop factor. An APS-C sensor, which is seen here on the 7D, 7 letter D Mark II, very, very typical on your intermediate cameras, and it has a crop factor of 1.6, specifically the 7D. If you are shooting on a Canon or on a Sony, they call it Super 35, which is around the same size as an APS-C sensor, and it has a crop factor of 1.5. To get the actual focal length of your lens that you're shooting on a camera that has a crop factor, you want to multiply it by that number. So if you're shooting a 50 millimeter on a 5D Mark III here with a full frame, and you move that lens over to the 7D Mark II, that 50 millimeter now is a 80 millimeter on the APS-C lens, because you are using the center of the lens, not the full size. So if you're shooting an 80 millimeter on the 7D Mark II and a 50 millimeter on the 5D Mark III, they would have the same field of view. You'd be able to see all the same things out of those cameras. Tips for beginners shooting B-roll with multiple subjects talking together. I want to feature close-ups each person. Julie, I would say make a plan before you get there. Make sure you get everything that you made a plan for, meaning your shot list. And then also try to be creative on location with doing some alternatives. Shooting at a different F number. Try shallow depth of field. Try a little deeper depth of field. Try the same shots but with a couple different exposure changes. And try some stuff you haven't got otherwise that might be helpful in the shoot. Now, for B-roll in general, it's just best to design it first, and then that way when you're on location shooting, all you have to do is to figure out the technical way to pull that off. You don't have to think of the shot and figure out how to shoot it with the lighting and all the rest. So it's best to have that design beforehand, so that way you're just left with the technical decisions on location. Moving on. So this is talking about the different sensor size and how all this works, right? So someone will say, hey, a full frame camera gets shallower depth of field than a micro four thirds camera. And that's a half truth. So let's look at these three shots here. So they're all framed the same. You look at each one of them, maybe there's little differences because I shot these handheld, but they're mostly exactly the same shot. But you see here, you're like, oh, but Chris, you just told me it doesn't matter depth of field, but look at the Canon 5D Mark III. That lens in the background, which I know is a 50 millimeter f1.2, is way blurrier than the one on the top, which is the GH4. Why is that? Well, look at the next thing. So this is shooting the same distance, but with a different focal length. So this is making so every single one of them is shooting the same, the same distance from your subject, but having a different lens on it. But you can see the settings are all the same. F4, ISO 120, 150th. But because the focal length is different, there's more in field. There's more in focus. So let's look at same focal length, but different distances from the subject. So they're all set at the same 35 millimeter equivalent. And you can see that the wider, the crop on the Micro Four Thirds makes that a lot tighter shot, and it's actually a wider shot there on the full frame because 35 millimeter. This is the difference that the sensor size makes on the field of view. But then if we look at this here, same focal length and distance. So these are all, the camera is the same distance from the subject. They all have the same settings, same 35 millimeter setting on their camera, but they all have different crops. And you can see the amount of what you see is very, very different, right? It looks like a really wide shot there on the bottom, but a really tight shot there on the Micro Four Thirds. So these are in essence the same, and they all have the same amount of depth of field. So if we look at this here, this is those same shots, but now cropped to match the same field of view. Now, unfortunately for the 5D, we're shooting at a lower resolution, so it looks a little blurry, but the depth of field is the same on all of these. And this is just managing that crop by cropping in post-production. Okay, depth of field for small sensor camcorders. All right, so zoom in, get further from your subject, increase your aperture, lots of light is needed. If you're able to, the lowest F number you can have your camera at, and the further you can zoom in, the more space compression is going to help you show off the depth of field that you are getting from that camera. That's just the only way to do it. It's the only way. You have to use space compression to get a shallow depth of field from a camcorder from other things. Now, there are cameras like the Sony ZV-E10 that now have, just like your iPhone has built-in bokeh that you can add. Now, the Sony camera actually changes the exposures based on that, but it works in the similar way that your iPhone would in adding a fake faux blur. So now tips. There is such a thing as too shallow. Don't shoot something really shallow if you don't have a need for it. Make sure the amount of depth of field matches what you're trying to communicate. Trust is in the eyes. Make sure the eyes of your subject are in focus and are on their point. If you're doing an interview of somebody and their eyes are not in focus, it's going to be hard for the viewer to trust them. Trust is in the eyes, so make sure that you get them in focus. And then, of course, focus, focus, focus. Identify your focal point and keep it in focus. When I am shooting interviews, every time we stop rolling, I check my focus. If I am shooting narrative, every time we restart a scene, I am checking my focus. There's nothing worse than executing an amazing shot and then not having the focal point on. It's just, you're going to be like, oh, I got to do it again. And of course, with the size of screens on the back of DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, if you don't have an external monitor, you will think it's in focus because the monitor is so small. You'll get it into your computer and everything will be soft. And that's a bummer. I've done it. Sucks. Not fun to do. Don't get carried away. Make depth of field decisions based on how the shot helps the story rather than how it looks. It's super... It's very easy to get into, I just want to get as shallow depth of field as I want. But that's kind of like a kid getting a brand new gift. Reminds me of someone the first time they've ever got an editing program and they try every single transition you could possibly think of, and likely a cut or a fade is all you'll ever need. 9 times out of 10, I'd say 95 times out of 100, a cut or a dissolve is what you're going to need. And all those other things are just kind of fun toys, but really don't have any place in serious filmmaking or content creation. So I'm going to open it up here. We have, looks like about 9 minutes worth of time to get questions. Any question you have, first off, about the presentation or anything about depth of field. Otherwise, ask a question about anything you want to know video production wise, and I'll try to answer it for you. Let's go over, while you're all thinking of your ideas, my little marketing spiel I'll have. Our next webinar is going to be creating titles and graphics. It's going to be on October 20th. All you got to do is go at the bottom of the page on videomaker.com/live, or go to videomakerevents.com, and you'll be able to sign up beforehand and get notifications. So like you did maybe today, you sign up beforehand and we'll send you an email like an hour before the webinar, and you'll be like, oh, cool, I'm going to jump on that. And it'll make it real easy for you. And you can also see all of our other events, and you can sign up for those as well. We have virtual events once a quarter, maybe more frequently than that, depending on the time of year. And then we do have webinars every month, and it'd be great for you to sign up for them. They're all really, really helpful. And we've gotten nothing but great reaction from those that are wanting to make better video through what they learn on our webinars. So Pete from Connecticut, as I like the depth of focus you have on your video right now. I do too. That's why F4 is a great place to start. I mean, it took me a long time of really fighting that. I mean, I love doing a beautiful shot. For the kind of content I get to make most of the time, I'm shooting myself, or I'm shooting some B-roll, and it's stuff that doesn't really matter there. But I get to test cameras all the time, so I'll go take them out in the field, and I'm always tempted to just do a really low F number and try to do some kind of shot. And I would just say, you know, you absolutely just want to shoot at F4, and it'll give you enough in focus that you'll get a shallow depth of field in a lot of shooting situations. That's going to be pleasing, and likely you're going to be able to keep your subject in focus. How would you recommend getting shallow depth of field on an iPhone? Same thing as the camcorder. Use the most telephoto lens on it. Zoom in and use that. That's the best you're going to do. Another thing with depth of field is if you darken your background, you're going to have more emphasis on your subject, and so sometimes you can hide your background through lighting choices, but that's not going to be through bokeh, through getting blur or bokeh, whatever way you want to pronounce it. So really not terribly easy or possible with fixed lens cameras with a small sensor. It's just harder. You want to make sure to zoom in. Focus peaking might be worth mentioning. Yes, turn on your focus peaking on your camera. If it has, a lot of cameras have multiple colors. Choose a color that's not in your scene already. If you're shooting a bunch of things in red and your focus peaking is in red, it's just not helpful. And make sure the strength of it is on enough that you can see it, so that you really know what is in focus if you aren't able to use, if you're using a smaller screen or not. Most of the focus peaking these days is actually really helpful, and I shoot with focus peaking on always when I'm shooting manually. So it's definitely really helpful to do. It's not as necessary the bigger your reference monitor is, because it's a lot easier to tell what's in focus when you actually have a larger screen to look at, or a larger quality screen, I guess, to look at. Let's see here. Is there a guide that shows how deep the depth of field is at different f-stops? Now, Mark, that's going to be a little bit different depending on the camera, the lighting situation, the lens you're using. Most still lenses are based on a formula, the F number that they put on them. They're not actually results from looking through the lens itself. Cinema cameras, so cameras that have a T-stop instead of an F-stop, that's actually based on the amount of light that goes through the lens. So it's testing how much light comes through it onto the other side. Whereas an F number, an f2.8 on a Nikon might be different than an f2.8 on a Sony. It's just how it is on still cameras, and most people don't jump around. They stick to a manufacturer and they go with it. Super easy for you to do if you want to do it with your own camera. Get a tape measure out. Make sure your exposure stays the same throughout your shot, so you're not getting darker or lighter from whatever shot you are, and see what the tape measure tells you at all your F numbers. This is what DPs do. This is why they really are married to their lenses. This is why they have a set of lenses that they might own that they want to use versus renting. Very much knowing your lenses is going to help you get that next level of image if you're looking for like filmmaking perfection. And the DPs I know are super geeks about lenses as well. So they're trying lenses that were never meant for filmmaking. They're making adapters for them. They're trying to use them, and then they know the limitations of that lens, if it's a specialty lens or if it's an effect lens, or it's a lens that they're using only to shoot at a low F number. There's a lot more photography benefits from a lower F number. Shooting astrophotography, a low F number is super helpful because you're doing a really long exposure. And so you want to be able to have the most light possible. So definitely something to pay attention to. How is the f-stop related to exposure? Can you affect one with not the other? F-stop is one of three controls of your exposure. F-stop, ISO, and shutter speed. Between those three, you can change your exposure. So I can shoot at this shot here, f4, but I could probably shoot it at f7.1 and have the same exact exposure, be same exposure here. You can see me just as well, but there would be a deeper depth of field. So if you are shooting at a lower F number, decrease your ISO to have, because the hole in your lens, which is the iris, the smaller it is, the more depth of field you have. The larger that opening is, the shallower the depth of field you have. It's counterintuitive. Smaller number, bigger hole, bigger number, smaller hole. It's kind of hard to follow, but it's just how it goes. Okay, well, looks like here, let's see here. Is there a good way to control depth of field with Bach lights in a studio? I don't want to feel like the shot is blown out and not in focus. So, you know, depends on the light you have. LED lights, almost all of them have a dimmer. How they dim, if they dim from 0% to 100 or from 100 to 50% and then off, it really depends on the quality of the light. The higher the quality of the light, the more control you're going to have, and the more scientific the controls are going to be. So they're going to actually tell you precisionally what the white balance is, precision, how much brightness percentage wise that you're going to be having. So those are one thing. Now, if you can't dim your lights because they don't have like their tungsten light, you can get, they're called router speed controls. But what they do is it actually, when you lower the amount of electricity going to the light, the color of the light actually goes down. So if you're on a tungsten light, which is typically 3200 Kelvin, if you dim it, it's going to go below that. You're going to start going into a smaller number of your light temperature. If you have auto white balance, it'll make up the difference, but that's how you can do it there. And of course, the easiest trick is back your light off from your subject. You want less light on your subject, back the lights off. If you're inside and shooting in a studio and your subject, or you're shooting inside where you have control of all of the lights, if your subject is overexposed, it means you're using too much light, and either turn off lights, back them off, or dim them if you're able. I think an f-stop has, as a fraction, 1/4 of something is more than 1/16th of something. Okay, yeah, you're right. I always just count it as it's the opposite of what it might seem. I always say, this is counterintuitive, therefore I am going to, the intuitive idea would be that they're connected. The smaller the F number, the smaller the aperture, but they're not connected. I know they're the opposite of that, so I just remember it that way. Yes, half is greater than 1/64th. However, if you ask a dummy, you know, people get confused by that stuff just as well too. So this is the one thing that if you need a cheat sheet, write it down. But honestly, this is working knowledge. This is stuff that if you just shoot and try out the different F numbers, pretty quickly you'll get an intuitive understanding of what they mean and how that means to you and where you want to shoot. F numbers are adjusted in third stop increments. So just like usually your ISO is also in that way. So if you do 3 clicks on your ISO, likely that's three times, it's doubling your light. So if you want to do, so say you're shooting at f4 ISO 100, if you want to go from f4 to f5.6, you would double your ISO. So you'd go, say it was 200, you go to 400. Now you can change your F number from f4 to f5.6 and your exposure will stay the same. This is how I test the ISOs on cameras, is to do an ISO ramp. So I keep the same exposure regardless of the F number to see at what point, at what ISO noise starts to enter the picture, as well as at what point the image starts getting degraded so much by that noise that it's no longer professionally usable. Okay, well, this is 12 o'clock. Remember, if you want to win a Rebel T7i, go to videomaker.com/win. It's ending soon, so this is your last chance to enter. And then go to videomakerevents.com and sign up for as many of the webinars as you find are interesting. You'll get an email reminding you of them. It's awesome. It's a really great program. Glad we have it. And if you have a hard time getting there, there's links at the bottom of this page. Whole f-stops, f5.6, f2.8, 5.6, f8, etc. Yeah. It's f5.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, and onward. But that doesn't really matter. You know, knowing that stuff, it doesn't matter. Just get the shot to look good. I mean, I said all these things and there's definitely technical things that you want to not do in some situations, but honestly, if it looks good and you can play it back and it plays back fine, likely it's good. It's really playing with your shutter speed that's going to make things look differently in a unpleasing way. That's why the true exposure triangle for video shooters is ISO and iris or F number. And then instead of shutter speed, you replace that with ND filters. So putting sunglasses on your lens instead of increasing the shutter speed to decrease the amount of light hitting the sensor. Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed the webinar. I've been Chris from Videomaker. Until next time, keep doing the hard work you do. Apply this stuff. Get it in your mind today. Go do something stupid that's going to teach this to you. Go film your dog and try to keep them in focus as they move around. If you have children, try to shoot them and figure out what F number you feel comfortable that you can keep them in focus. Try to apply this information today, and that way it's going to be working knowledge for you the next time you need to use it.